Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of 10 minutes of ranting and raving on a vaguely or specifically ancient military topic, where I attempt to answer a question from a reader, viewer, or listener. You can ask us a question many ways, and in fact, some of the questions coming up have found new ways to get me. You can send us a postcard, of course, or a letter. Woohoo! Excitement. The address is PO Box 222, Belfield, 2191, Australia. That will get to me. You can comment on a previous video or podcast. That will get to me. You can just put a comment on Facebook. That will get to me. You can even track me down on Facebook Messenger and send me a message. That will get to me too. All of these things are coming up in the next sort of lot of questions that I answer, this way of doing it. You can, of course, back us on Patreon, one of three different levels: Legionary, Centurion, and Optio. Wait, I put them in the wrong order. Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. And you get a digital copy with Optio and a physical copy of the magazine with Centurion. Okay, now, today's question is a really interesting one. And this is a two-parter coming from Carlos. So I will read, I'll do the first one because it's interesting by itself, and then I'll do the second one later. Hi Murray, even though I've been an AWM subscriber for long, I only recently started listening to the podcast. I love the AWA episodes, thank you very much, and the regular group podcast too. Thank you very much. I'm speaking on behalf of the regular crew. I have a two-part question. First, I have read in various places that there were certain requirements to be admitted as a legionary in the army of the Principate. For example, I've read in a popular magazine, not Ancient Warfare magazine, that legionaries needed to be at least 1.80 meters tall. This sounds difficult to believe. I have also read that all legionaries needed to be able to read and write. This sounds more believable as a declaration of intentions, but it seems unlikely that it could actually be enforced. What were the actual requirements other than being a Roman citizen in the Principate? Okay, well, Carlos, where you've come across that is a misreading of Vegetius's De Re Militari, or Epitoma Re Militaris, this one here. This is the translation by Milner. So in Book 1, Section 5 is where this all comes from. And so what he tells us is that the height of a Roman recruit was 5 foot 10 inches, but that is Roman feet. And so not modern 5 foot 10, which is where the 180 centimeters comes from. And so that essentially you've got and there's a different height for cavalry and a different height for infantry, which we'll get to in a second. Now, the fascinating thing about that then is that 5 foot 10, the Roman foot is not the same. It's 11.65 English inches, 29.6 centimeters. And so Roman 5 foot 10 translates to about 171 or 172 centimeters, which in modern money, well, in imperial money, so I'm speaking to those of you in North America, Liberia, and Myanmar by talking about feet and inches, is 5 foot 7.5 to 5 foot 8, which is a far more believable average height for a Roman legionary recruit. Now, that's for infantry. The interesting thing is that we also have evidence, and this might come into the dating of Vegetius, because Vegetius is writing between 383 and 450. He refers to Gratian, and therefore we know that he's writing after Gratian died, and he writes before he's quoted in a veterinary manual in the 450s. So we've got that period. I prefer the earlier period, around 383. Others prefer later. And the reason that that's interesting in terms of this height passage is that Valentinian, who was the emperor from 364 to 375, he lowers the height requirement. And so he actually lowers it to 5 foot 7 in Roman feet, which is about 165 centimeters. Now, that's a modern 5 foot 5. And interestingly, excavated Roman skeletons generally on average between 164 and 168 centimeters, which for Vegetius's 5 foot 10 is too short. So, you're 3 centimeters short of his 5'10" if you're 168 centimeters tall, so you're an inch too small. And what does that mean in terms of, is it a requirement that you're only taking the top heights and not the average, and so therefore it's a much smaller section of society? Yes, but the reason that Vegetius is talking about this recruit is to reform the Roman army. And this is one of the reasons I think his dating is closer to the disaster of Adrianople in 378 than later, because he's talking about all the things that need to be reformed in the Roman army to improve it based on its recent experiences. And so post-Adrianople, but not to post-Adrianople, is for me a better context for it. And so in that sense, when he's talking about the heights of recruits, he's talking about an ideal. And what he describes in the second book is this whole idea of the old legion, the Legio Antica, the antique legion, and how strong it was. And there's all sorts of complications as to what is he describing. Is it a real thing? Is it a compilation of real things in the past? Because I think he talks about 6,000 men in the legion, which is not a strength of the legion in the 4th century. Now, the interesting thing there, of course, is that he writes the first book by itself as what kind of men should be recruited into the army, what sort of training should they get. And that's also where your second part of this first question comes from, the idea that they should all be literate. Probably they were not all literate. They certainly needed to sign, but that could have been done with a mark. But they certainly needed to be literate enough to understand their orders. And I think there have been some studies done on exactly how much Latin would need to have been understood by a recruit. And it's not a great deal, because, of course, in the Roman army, the orders are delivered in Latin, not Greek, even in the East. And so they would need to understand Latin, but probably about 50 words. And, they would get the gist of what it is what they needed to do, which wouldn't take very long. And certainly if you got it wrong, you would find out very quickly you got it wrong, and so therefore correct yourself. So all of these things that Vegetius is saying, these are the sorts of people we should recruit into the legions, is a reform document about this is how we fix the problems with the Roman army. Now, fascinatingly, he says in the preface to book 2, thank you, emperors, for reading my book, and therefore he writes the remaining 3 books. And so whatever he suggests in book 1 is in fact paid attention to, and he is thanked and encouraged to contribute more. Now, the fascinating thing about that, and this is a little bit off topic, is there's a whole series of these libellus pamphlets, reform documents at this time. And again, this is another reason why I think it's earlier rather than later. When you look at the De Rebus Bellicus by the Anonymous, when you look at the Breviarium of Festus, even the one of Eutropius, they are also suggesting this reforms to the military at the time, or the way that the army should behave. And so if you take that sort of 10 to 12 year period, there's a whole bunch of suggestions about reforming the Roman army. Now, those breviaria and the De Rebus Bellicus are written before the disaster of Adrianople, even before the disaster of allowing the Goths to cross the Danube in 376, because they talk about the barbarians are on the outside of the empire. They haven't been allowed in yet. And so that hasn't happened. But it fits into that whole milieu where you've got authors writing books about the reform of the Roman army as a way of encouraging their own career, hoping that the emperor will take notice of them. And that seems to be what happens for Vegetius. And so you get that idea. Now, reading some more Vegetius, what you've got is the idea that height, 5'10", is only for the first cohort, and so of the legion, not every legionary. So when it says this is the height requirement, it's not the height requirement according to Vegetius. They've read the first sentence and not the second sentence. So you basically have shorter men in the remaining parts of the legion. So if you're 5'5", so 164 to 168 centimeters, you can be a legionary. You just can't join the first cohort of a legion. We don't hear, as far as I'm aware, of people cheating on the height requirement. Now, I say this because my wife used to work for an airline, and of course there's a height requirement for aircrew, for staff on stewards and stewardesses. And when they were recruiting them, all sorts of shenanigans were being done to get that extra inch. You had high hairdos, beehives, you had platform shoes, you had all sorts of things for these people to just make the height requirement. So I imagine that if you were desperate to be in a legion, even in the first cohort of a legion, you might easily fake your height so that you could be 5'10" in Roman inches. But to your question, it's not modern 5'10", it's Roman 5'10", which is equivalent of about modern 5'7.5" to 5'8", and there's other evidence that it's lowered under Valentinian, so it's even 5'5" in Roman terms. So, 5'5" in modern terms, 5'7" in Roman terms, 165 centimeters. So many numbers. And again, looking through Vegetius's book 1, you've got what trades should be accepted and which trades should be rejected, what age recruits should be had, whether you should get them from the city or the country, the regional. If you're from a hot climate, you're a better soldier than you are if you're from a cold climate, and all that sort of thing. You've got, of course, the controversial recruits being marked with a tattoo. Anyone who's seen Gladiator, of course, knows that Russell Crowe cuts his tattoo off. There's no evidence that actually it was around in the 2nd century. The military step also train them in running and jumping. They should be trained in the art of swimming, which possibly implies that it follows on from a disaster in a river crossing. They should be trained with wicker shields and posts, which again we know from earlier things like Polybius. They should be taught to strike not with the edge but with the point, stab. They should be taught dueling, the armatura. There's some articles in the magazine about that. They should be trained at throwing javelins, trained in arrows, which is a very interesting late Roman requirement, that the Roman legionary should be an archer. They should be trained in firing stones from slings. They should be trained with the plumbata, or weighted darts. These are all late 4th century concerns rather than earlier ones. They should be trained in mounting horses. They should be trained to carry a burden. Types of, building camps, where the camps should be built, the shapes of camps, the fortifications of a camp. The camp should be built when under threat from the enemy, and how recruits should be trained to keep ranks and intervals in the line, and the distances that they should move. That's all in Book 1. And as I said before, when he starts Book 2, preface to Book 2, but your tranquility, invincible emperor, with loftier counsel than an earthly mind could have conceived, requires ancient examples from books. Therefore, when I was commanded to collect this material in a written epitome for your majesty, not so much to learn as to recollect, devotion to the truth often contended with embarrassment. So he's asked by the emperor to write the second book, and so he contributes Book 2, 3, and 4. So I hope, Carlos, that's answered your first question about the height of Roman recruits. Just to recap, it's 5'10" Roman feet, which is equivalent to the modern 5'7.5" or 5'8". That is 171 to 172 centimetres, not the modern 180 centimetres. But that is also only for the cavalry and for the first cohort of the legions. The remainder of the legions could probably be shorter. Join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.